کنفرانس درباره قتل عام زندانیان سیاسی و نسل کشی مجاهدین در سال ۶۷ با حضور کارشناسان، گزارشگران و حقوقدانان برجسته بین المللی در پی انتشار گزارش تاریخی جاوید رحمان. ۳ شهریور ۱۴۰۳ 24 اوت 2024.
سخنرانی‌های کنت لوئیس، وکیل مجاهدین در دادگاه سوئد در محاکمه یک مأمور قتل عام حمید نوری و پروفسور کلودیو گروسمن، مشاور ویژه دادستان دیوان بین المللی جنایی.
کنت لوئیس: فتوای خمینی در سال 1367 نه یک فتوا بلکه یک حکم یا دستور است. خمینی میگوید کسانی که در زندانهای سراسر کشور بر سر موضع نفاق خود پافشاری کرده و میکنند، محارب و محکوم به اعدام میباشند. این یک انگیزه مذهبی برای نابودی زندانیان است. هیچ شکی در این مورد وجود ندارد و این منجر به اعدام 30,000 زندانی در سراسر ایران شد. رژیم هر سال میلیون‌ها دلار خرج می‌کند تا تبلیغات دروغین علیه سازمان مجاهدین خلق را در کشورهای غربی پخش کند. علاوه بر این، رژیم حتی حملات تروریستی علیه حامیان سازمان مجاهدین در غرب و در گرد همایی‌ها را ترتیب داده است.
Madam Rajavi, learned colleagues, brothers and sisters, friends. I think most of you know that I had the honor of representing a number of plaintiffs belonging to the PMOI in the trial of Hamid Nouri in Stockholm. That the trial in the district court took place for 92 days, and the court even traveled to Albania for 2 weeks to allow very important testimony from members of the PMOI. The court heard testimony from 34 plaintiffs and 26 witnesses. In addition, we had a whole number of so-called expert witnesses, professors and other legal experts. I think you also know that Hamid Nouri was convicted to life in prison for his participation in the massacre of political prisoners in Goardash prison outside Tehran. The fact that the Swedish courts called his crimes a violation of international law as far as the members of the PMOI was concerned, and they called it murder regarding the leftist prisoners who were executed. The crime against international law, according to Swedish law, was a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions in the form of war crimes. I'm going to explain a little bit later. I won't bore you with but the district court in Stockholm and subsequently also the Court of Appeals chose to take the prosecutor's primary option, which was stating that the 1988 massacre was a part of an international armed conflict between Iran and Iraq. At that time, we did not have crimes against humanity in Swedish law. And this is one of the explanations why the court went in that direction. From the very outset of this case, I questioned the prosecutor's choice of war crimes as the basis of the indictment especially with regard to the international armed conflict between Iran and Iraq. The problem facing the prosecutors, as I just mentioned, was that the possibility of prosecuting Hamid Nouri for crimes against humanity didn't exist in Swedish law. It was only introduced into Swedish law in 2014, rather late. And the events of this case, as we all know, took place in 1988. So we were forced to follow an older law. And this was also the reason the prosecutors chose this avenue. My own opinion, having worked with the PMOI since 2003, was that the regime's intent to exterminate the PMOI was religiously motivated and was based on their opinion that the PMOI represented religious heretics. This intent to exterminate the PMOI existed already long before June 20th, 1981, and that's the date when the PMOI was finally forced to take up arms to defend itself and to defend democracy in Iran after having been attacked at this mass demonstration. Thus, the policy of exterminating the PMOI has no nexus or connection with the non-international armed conflict either, since the non-international armed conflict began after the 20th of June, 1981. In addition, there was no nexus or connection to the international armed conflict between Iran and Iraq. We all know that that war began in 1980. We also know that the People's Mujahideen went to the front line and fought against Iraq at that time until they were stopped by the regime. The PMOI only came to Iraq in 1986. So to claim that there was nexus just on the basis of their presence there at the very end of this conflict, in my opinion, doesn't hold water. And I would also refer to the testimony of Ambassador Lincoln Bloomfield, who has shown clearly that there was no, and this is a legal concept, overall control from the side of the Iraqis in relation to the NLA or the PMOI in Iraq. This is very important. But for about 2.5 years, I tried to convince the Swedish prosecutors to consider the possibility of including the crime of genocide in the indictment. I demonstrated for them, for one thing, that the adjustment of the indictment would have only required about 4 or 5 sentences because it was the same actual crimes which had been committed. It's just how you call them, what is the name of the crime. We tried for a long time, as I said, to convince them, and we tried to show that there was a religious intention, and this is completely in agreement with the report of the United Nations, that this intention to exterminate the PMOI existed already in 1979, after the mullahs had taken power. In August of 1979, Khomeini said, "We will act with them as we act with non-Muslims, with hypocrites, and we will suppress them." In June 1980, he said, "They were able to fool our pure, credulous, truthful young people with their propaganda they know and know well. This is religious understanding of the PMOI. And the result of Khomeini's and the regime's positions, and I'm sure that Professor Rachman has been able to find lots of them. I have dozens of them. If you like any, I'll send them to you. We see the result of this, for instance, in a decision written by the president of the so-called Revolutionary Court in Ban in July 24th, 1980. 1980. And he wrote, in the name of God, according to the decree of Imam Khomeini, the people's mujahideen are apostates and worse than non-believers. They do not deserve any property rights and not even the right to life. Therefore, the Islamic Revolutionary Court should not pay any attention to their false complaint. This is a court, one of the revolutionary courts set up by the mullahs. And they point out that Khomeini had already said they have not the right to property and not the right to life. What is that? Of course, we have also the so-called fatwa of Khomeini from 1988. And I say so-called because we had a big discussion about that in the court. I don't think it was a fatwa. The fatwa is a religious opinion. And this text was a hukm. That means a decree to be followed by everyone in the country. And if you read it carefully, you'll see that it's not a religious opinion. It's a hukm. It's an order. And inside this fatwa, we all know this famous sentence in which Khomeini says that those who are imprisoned throughout the country and remain steadfast in their support for the Monafiqeen, the Mujahideen, are waging war on God and are condemned to execution. This is a religious motivation for the extermination, in this case, of prisoners. There can be no doubt about that. And it led to the execution of 30,000 prisoners all over Iran. Even after the massacre, which happened in 1988, leading members of the regime have continued to have this genocidal policy. I'll only give you one example, and it's from the thankfully late, President Ibrahim Raisi, who already in 2009 said, Muharebi sometimes refers to an organization. An organization becomes Muhareb organization, such as the People's Mujahideen. In the case of the MEK organization, anyone who in any way contributes to the MEK because it is an organized group is referred to as Muharebe. And of course, the penalty for Muhareb is execution, it's death. And there are many very good discussions in Professor Rachman's report. I'm especially happy about the conclusion of the report, in which Professor Rachman says very clearly that the Special Rapporteur calls upon individual member states of the United Nations to make use of universal jurisdiction to investigate, issue arrest warrants against and prosecute individuals for atrocity crimes committed during the 1980s and in particular during 1981, 82, and 1988, including crimes against humanity as well as genocide. This is an extremely brave and clear conclusion. When discussing with the prosecutors during these years, beyond trying to show the genocidal intent of the regime, which I think has been very clearly demonstrated, I tried to get them to understand that the PMOI developed its political positions from a modern and humane interpretation of Islamic scriptures and concepts. The fact that religious reformism develops into a political movement does not alter the fact that an organization, in this case the PMOI, should still be considered a religious group in the context of the Genocide Convention. And this is very, very important. We have both the question of intent and we have the question of what is the group. So this is my firm opinion. As we know, after the trial of Hamid Nouri, his sentence of life imprisonment in the district court was upheld in the Court of Appeal. And the regime, by taking hostages, Swedish citizens hostage, was able to exchange Hamid Nouri for 2 Swedish citizens. In my opinion, this was disgraceful. This is a denial of justice for the victims and for the victims' families, that the Swedish government let this guy be pardoned simply to bring home 2 Swedish citizens. And it only encourages the regime to continue its hostage politics. In this case, in the courts, it was a great victory. A great victory in the sense that for the first time in a court of law, all of the evidence about the massacre of 1988 has been presented, mainly around Goardas, but if you read the decision and if you hear the testimony of all the people, they spoke about what happened even in Evin and even in other prisons and so on. This is historical. This is a victory that we should never underestimate. This is the beginning of the real legal documentation of these crimes which have been committed. And this evidence is still going to exist forever because it's been recorded, all of this testimony. On a completely other note, as a lawyer who has been dealing with the Mujahideen for many, many years, I want to mention the regime's latest tactic to try to avert attention from their ongoing crimes against humanity. Since about 2 years, the regime has been spreading false propaganda concerning the evacuation of the children from Camp Ashraf in Iraq at the time of the first Gulf War. And the regime has financed films, articles, and so on, claiming that children who returned to Camp Ashraf years later, Camp Ashraf Et, were used as child soldiers in ongoing fighting with the regime. Why do I talk about this? It's important to understand what the regime is doing to try to avert attention from its own crimes. And in reality, we know that the regime spends millions of dollars every year to plant propaganda to discredit the PMI in Western countries. And in addition, we know something worse, and that is that the regime has even organized terrorist attacks on persons supporting the PMOI in the West and on meetings. You all remember the attempt to bomb the 2018 meeting in Paris. So we're dealing with a regime of terrorists, and what we can hope is that the perpetrators of these crimes will one day soon be held accountable for their crimes, and hopefully that will be in the International Court of Criminal Court. Thank you.
پروفسور کلودیو گروسمن. گزارش جاوید رحمان با توجه به جدیت و مبانی قانونی مورد استناد و صحت ادعاهای آن و از نقطه نظر جایگاه نظارت و تلاش برای دستیابی به حسابرسی و توصیف وضعیت کنونی در ایران و آنچه در سال 1367 رخ داده بسیار برجسته است. وقتی شاهد گستردگی قتل عام‌ها و کشتارهایی هستیم که صورت گرفته، این فراخوانی برای اقدام و ضرورت مبارزه به منظور دستیابی به حسابرسی به خاطر این قتل عام وحشتناک است که به عنوان یکی از بدترین قتل عام‌های صورت گرفته توسط یک حکومت در قرن 20 برجسته است. می‌خواهم همبستگی خود را با قربانیان و بازماندگان قتل عام‌های سال 67 ابراز کنم و بر لزوم همکاری جمعمان برای دستیابی به اقدام مؤثر تاکید کنم تا بتوانیم در جهانی زندگی کنیم که ایران به عنوان یک جامعه آزاد در کمک به آن سهیم باشد.
It's important indeed because of many reasons, and each of them are so powerful that each of them would be enough to consider this very relevant and meaningful gathering. The first one is that we're receiving the report of Dr. Jaavid Rehman released on July 17th. As a former chair of the Committee Against Torture myself and former president of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, I had the opportunity to see and participate in numerous reports. But this one stands out because of the seriousness, soulfulness, the legal grounds invoked, the veracity of its assertions, and really from the point of view of a contribution in general to what it means supervision, an attempt to achieve accountability, and the description of the situation that is taking place in Iran and took place in 1998 stands out as one, as I said before, of the top documents that have been really composed and created by a rapporteur in the international community. My sincere congratulations to Dr. Rehman for this very important report. Dr. Rehman have been a vehicle to tell this horror story of what happened in Iran. And the content of this report is also what it stands out. It's difficult to think about a massacre of more than 30,000 people. Again, Iran has with this one of the world records in terms of the extensity and atrocity committed, the atrocities committed in 1988. One person's violation of human rights is enough to ask for accountability, for reparations, to express solidarity of the victims. And when we witness the extent of the massacres and the killings that took place, is simply something that defies our imagination. But it's not only a question of defiance, it's a call for action, for a need to struggle to achieve, among other things, accountability for this awful massacre that I said before stand out as one of the worst massacres committed by a government in the 20th century. I mentioned a third reason why this is a very important report, because it's a call for action. It's a call for action because of the atrocities committed and because of the need for accountability and the need to offer reparations, full reparations to the victim, including monetary damages, the moral suffering, the obligation of non-repetition, measures of satisfaction, and accountability. That's what constitutes a holistic reparation. And why that would be enough to justify the need for action, there is also another reason why a need for action is essential, namely the fact that when this type of atrocities do not result in action, in accountability, in telling the truth and reparation, they are simply announcing that more atrocities will follow. And this is what happened in Iran. The international community has witnessed the fact that hundreds of people opposing the current situation in Iran, have been exterminated abroad, for example. And we have seen again a lack of accountability. And again, we have witnesses, among others, extensive repression, as it happened in 2022, where we witnessed in horror how peaceful demonstrations were brutally repressed. One of the key characteristics of the 21st century has been the struggle against discrimination for any reason, including the discrimination against women. And the lack of accountability, the fact that atrocities can continue to occur, has led, among other things, to the fact that women have been repressed for peacefully demonstrating for their rights. And numerous of them have been killed, as it is publicly known by the international community. The fact that a lack of accountability and full reparation has taken place continues to exist as we are talking now. We have heard in horror that on the 7th of August of this year, 29 people were hanged, a record in terms of the killing in a single day by hanging of by a government in the world. This is something unacceptable, and it constitutes an outright and direct violation of customary norms and treaties to which Iran is compelled to abide. I come from an hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, where we have non-repression and disappearances and torture. I myself was exposed to that repression. Among other things, I could not return to my home country, Chile, for 13 years. And as a former also president of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, we have issued statements and exposed and struggled for accountability in violations in the hemisphere. But we have witnessed also the value of action, the value of international solidarity, the value of statements accompanying the victims. After the Second World War, the international community adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was a very important document because it established something essential. It didn't matter your religion, your political adherences, the color of your skin, your gender. What it mattered there and what the international community established there was that all of us had rights at the international level. The international community, on the basis of the Universal Declaration, continue to develop that promise of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that created, as I said, this idea that all of us count, that all of us have rights that can be required and implemented at the international level. That opened the space for treaties, that opened the space for commissions, for courts, that opened the states for individual and collective liability, for example, in the form, in the Statute of Rome, and in the fact that those commit international crimes cannot leave their own countries because they will be held accountable by the international community. It's still a work in progress, and we cannot ensure that the promise of the Universal Declaration has been fully implemented. But we have achieved something: the existence of a world conscience, the idea that this is not a matter only, in this case, that of the suffering of people in Iran, the idea that what happens in Iran affects us all. And this is not only a question of the problems that are created by activities that constitute terrorism, but because of values, because we all adhere that this idea that human rights exist and that individuals are entitled to develop themselves to the limit of their potential. As I close my remarks, I want to extend my solidarity to the victims, to the survivors of the massacres of 1988, and reiterate the need for all of us to work together in order to achieve effective action so that we can live in a world and have the contribution in Iran as a free society. Thank you very much.